I'm just an average alpha. My partner, though, a top-tier Omega. Everyone around us says I'm nowhere near good enough for Angus, and honestly, he seems to agree. The truth is, our marriage was nothing more than a bizarre twist of fate, a complete misunderstanding from the very start. So, when intimate photos of him with someone else lit up my phone screen yet again, I just knew. It was time to walk away. Ending this loveless marriage would be the ultimate liberation for us both. But Harry's the one thing I absolutely never saw coming. After the divorce, Angus' lover started relentlessly chasing after me, practically begging for my affection every single day. Main text: Elliot and Angus went way back. High school classmates turned college roommates. Angus was always sneaking out early and stumbling back late, and Elliot was the one constantly covering his tracks. Sometimes it was grabbing him late-night snacks. Other times, it was answering roll call when Angus couldn't drag himself out of bed. They were worlds apart. Elliot was just the invisible roommate, while Angus was the golden boy, the untouchable heir to the Koch family empire. Their friends used to joke that Angus must have saved Elliot's life in a past life. Funny enough, they weren't entirely wrong. Angus actually had saved him. Because of that, Elliot made a point to do whatever he could to pay him back. He always figured that after graduation, they'd go their separate ways like two parallel lines, never to cross again. That was, until a perfectly crafted caramel macchiato was slid across the table, right in front of him. Under the warm ambient glow of the cafe's pendant lights, Dennis, the head of the Koch family, sat with his legs elegantly crossed. As a top-tier Omega, his presence carried an inescapable domination that instantly swallowed the surrounding chatter. "You must be Elliot." Dennis tapped his fingertips rhythmically against the bone china cup. The light caught the edge of his glasses, reflecting an undeniable, irresistible magnetism. 100 million. "Next month, you marry my son." Elliot's jaw tightened, casting a sharp shadow in the warm light. "Why me?" "Because in all these years, you're the only person Angus has ever admitted to liking." That word like traced back to a class reunion just the night before. They were playing Truth or Dare. Elliot's collar was slightly open, the corners of his eyes flushed from the alcohol, his fingertips trembling faintly after taking too many penalty shots on Angus' behalf. Sitting next to him, Angus looked like a detached god, his chin slightly raised, his striking features flickering in the shifting strobe lights. "Is there anyone in this room you like?" The crowd's cheering almost blew the roof off. Elliot's hazy gaze drifted up the elegant line of Angus' neck. He fully expected the arrogant heir to refuse the question, already bracing himself to down another drink for him. But then, the unthinkable happened. "Yeah, I do." "Elliot." It felt like all the air was instantly sucked out of the room. Elliot turned his head in a daze, his eyes colliding with Angus, which were reflecting the warm, amber lights of the bar. Under the flashing neon, the corners of Angus' mouth slowly curled into a clear, devastatingly deceptive smile. If it were the Elliot of today, he would have snatched the glass without hesitation, downed the amber liquid, and shot back a calm smile to deflect the cruel joke. But back then, he just froze, letting the gears of fate violently shift off track amid the roaring laughter of the crowd. At the time, Elliot didn't realize he was the punchline. He took relationships seriously and had zero interest in marrying for money. But caught between Dennis' relentless pressure and his own desperate need to repay his debt to Angus, especially knowing about Angus' S-class physiology and his dangerously unstable mental state, he caved. After countless sleepless nights staring at the ceiling under the dim glow of his desk lamp, he finally typed a single word on his screen. "Okay." 4 years. Over 1,400 days and nights. Inside their sprawling marital home, there was always just one dim floor lamp left burning. Countless times, Elliot would sit on the rug, watching the tiny dust motes aimlessly rise and fall in the soft light. Angus' attitude was like an impenetrable fog. Occasionally, he would lean in close, and the air would spark with a warm amber intimacy, the lighting turning thick and heavy with unspoken tension. But in the next breath, those sparks would instantly die out, leaving nothing but freezing ash in their wake. Until today. The afternoon sun filtered through the flower shop's glass window, casting a soft, golden halo over the giant clusters of sunflowers and lisianthus. Basking in the quiet warmth, Elliot leaned against the counter, half a sandwich in his hand. Suddenly, his phone screen lit up. The piercing, cold white glare instantly slashed through the tranquility. It was a photo taken in a dimly lit bar corridor. Angus was pinned against the wall by a towering alpha, locked in a deep kiss, their tangled silhouettes stretched long across the concrete. It was Angus' latest soothing agent, his fix on the side. The sweet richness of the mayo melted on his tongue, only to turn into a bitter, suffocating taste he could barely swallow. Elliot lowered his eyelashes, chewing mechanically. Top-tier Omegas didn't actually rely on alphas once they reached full adulthood. Angus should have been free a long time ago. Back then, Elliot had swallowed all his pride and grievances for the sake of Ivan, who was still just a baby in arms, wailing the second Elliot stepped away. But now, Ivan, utterly spoiled by Dennis, looked at Elliot with nothing but coldness and evasion. He slowly swallowed his last bite, his fingertip lightly tapping the screen. "Come home tonight. We need to talk." The message sank like a stone in the ocean. Elliot pushed open the flower shop door and headed toward the building that was about to be stripped of the title home. The setting sun stretched his shadow far across the pavement. Every step he took was absolute. 2 in the morning. The entryway sensor light flicked on with a soft click. The warm yellow glow pushed back the darkness of the living room, but it couldn't touch the suffocating dead silence hanging in the air. Angus pushed the door open, his tailored suit jacket draped casually over his arm. He lifted his gaze, instantly catching sight of Elliot sitting perfectly still in the dead center of the sofa. There was no warm hangover soup waiting on the table, no slippers neatly placed by the door. Just Elliot, his eyes darker and quieter than the night outside. "You're still up?" Angus' brow furrowed slightly, his tone completely indifferent. Elliot didn't stand. He kept his spine rigid, staring coldly at the man reeking of alcohol. The lighting around them seemed to sense the snapping tension, the edges of the room beginning to faintly tremble. "I sent you a message. Did you see it?" Elliot's voice was completely flat, stripped of any emotion. Angus raised an eyebrow. Right in front of him, he pulled out his phone, his long fingers swiping impatiently across the screen. The faint glow illuminated his flawless profile. "I see it now," Angus said, the corner of his mouth tugging into a careless smirk. He tossed the phone onto the table like it was nothing. He turned and walked toward the kitchen. The clink of a glass against the marble countertop rang out sharp and clear. Water cascaded into the glass. Gripping it, Angus stepped back into the dim light, walking toward Elliot step by step. The air between them was pulled taut. A silent, violent storm was about to tear through this illusion of domestic warmth. The soft orange floor lamp cast a quiet silhouette of Elliot over the single sofa. Angus had no choice but to sit across from him on the love seat. They faced each other across the marble coffee table like a standoff wrapped in velvet. "All right, let's talk. What is it?" Angus let go of his glass. The sharp clack broke the manufactured warmth of the room. "If this is about bringing Ivan back here, drop it. He needs to stay at the main estate for a proper education. It's not about Ivan." Elliot lifted his eyes. His gaze pierced straight through the hazy light, not backing down for a second. "I want a divorce." Angus' face, flawlessly contoured by the warm shadows, instantly froze. His brows locked together. "What did you just say?" "A divorce. Well, file the papers tomorrow. I'm walking away with nothing." Elliot's voice was lighter than the moonlight spilling through the window. Angus' chest heaved. Suddenly, the cozy orange light in the room seemed disrupted by an intense magnetic field. The lamp filaments let out a fragile, overwhelmed buzz. Sharp, deep blue electrical ripples jagged visibly through the air, the inescapable spatial anomaly of a high-tier Omega pushed over the edge. He violently yanked at his tie, his breathing heavy and ragged. Ivan cannot lose his alpha father. If you're pissed off about something, just say it. I'm not pissed off. And if you're worried about custody, the kid is yours. Elliot was as placid as a pool of still water. "I only have one demand. A divorce." Angus didn't answer. His jaw clenched so tight, the veins bulged behind his ears. After what felt like an eternity, he abruptly stood up. His towering frame blocked out most of the light, casting Elliot into a heavy, suffocating shadow. "I don't agree to this. I'm busy. I'm going to bed." He spun on his heel, taking massive, aggressive strides away. "I really think this is for the best. For both of us," Elliot said, his eyes glued to Angus' retreating figure. The warm floor lamp stretched Angus' shadow across the floor. For a split second, that endlessly arrogant spine went completely rigid. Then, His footsteps turned erratic and rushed, betraying the desperate, panicked flight of a man who was utterly losing control. The next day, sunlight sliced through the blinds, casting warm, golden bars across the messy bed in the guest bedroom. The entire mansion was dead empty, the silence broken only by the soft, rhythmic rustle of pages turning in the study as the hours slipped by, until a screen lit up, shattering the lazy afternoon haze. Another photo. Two hands tightly intertwined in the sunlight, the luxury watch on Angus' wrist catching a blinding glare. It was another taunt from that same alpha from the bar. Elliot stared at those clasped hands on the screen, his eyes completely deadpan. His long fingers tapped out a quick text, "Let's meet." Dead silence from the other end. Elliot grabbed a lightweight beige trench coat and walked out into the fading twilight. The club. Amber spotlights washed over the room, making the whole place look like melted caramel. Elliot wove through the heavy crowd. Before his eyes could even adjust to the dim, warm glow, a deeply powerful arm snaked around his waist, pulling him flush against a burning hot chest. Elliot snapped his head back in shock. The face he'd seen countless times in those photos was suddenly magnified in the hazy club lighting. Before he could even push away, a massive hand locked onto the back of his neck. The air around the alpha violently warped. Bursts of deep, dominating red light flared out of nowhere, swallowing the cozy caramel glow like boiling magma, searing the retinas. A second later, the alpha dipped his head and captured Elliot's lips in a crushing kiss. Elliot's pupils blew wide. He raised a hand to slap him, but his wrist was caught mid-air with effortless precision. A wicked, taunting smirk tugged at the corner of the alpha's mouth. He dragged Elliot's wrist to his lips, parting them just enough for his canines to sink lightly into the skin, leaving two deep, flushed indents in his warm palm. "Looking forward to our next meeting." The alpha released his grip and vanished into the sea of caramel lights like a sudden gale. The stinging in his palm and the faint tremor in his fingertips made Elliot's stomach turn. He shook his hand in sheer disgust and spun on his heel, heading straight for the restroom hallway. The sconces in the hallway gave off a soft, healing halo, but right then, the lights violently flickered. A cold, sharply knuckled hand wrapped around Elliot's wrist with an inescapable magnetism, pinning him in place. "Do you ever quit?" Elliot was completely pushed to the edge. He spun around and swung his arm with everything he had. Smack! The sharp, stinging sound of a slap echoed through the narrow hallway. Elliot looked up, chest heaving, but his breath instantly caught in his throat. Standing under the warm light wasn't the arrogant alpha from the club. It was Angus. The soft glow of the hallway suddenly felt like shredded glass. Frantic, pale cracks of frost ripped through the air. The temperature plummeted so fast that every breath turned into thick white plumes. The absolute domination of an S-class Omega on the brink of losing control was practically collapsing the entire space. A raw, red handprint was already swelling on Angus' left cheek. His usually indifferent eyes were now completely bloodshot, locking onto Elliot with a suffocating intensity, looking ready to devour him whole. "You've really outdone yourself, Elliot." Angus hissed the words through gritted teeth, a muscle feathering wildly along his jaw. "Cheating on me right to my face, and then you have the nerve to hit me?" Elliot's brows pulled tight. "What cheating? Who was that guy just now?" Angus tightened his grip, his knuckles turning stark white as he practically crushed Elliot's wrist. The frost fractures in the air spread like wildfire, completely swallowing the last trace of warmth from the sconces. "No wonder you suddenly wanted to walk away with nothing. You already had your next target lined up? You think I neglected you? You want thrills? I'll give you thrills." Elliot's eyes went wide. Staring at the utterly paranoid man in front of him, his fingertips trembled from a mix of sharp pain and pure disbelief. "Angus, are you out of your mind?" "I am perfectly fine." Angus yanked him flush against his chest. The dangerous red tint in the corners of his eyes was terrifying under the icy, fractured light. "You hit me over that side piece. You crossed the line for him. Elliot, you're done." The warm orange streetlights along the drive were stretched into frantic, flashing blurs across the windows of the Maybach. Angus' profile flickered in the shifting shadows, radiating an intimidating, stone-cold rigidity. In the master bedroom, the healing, warm yellow floor lamp that was always kept on now served as the sole witness to their standoff. Angus pinned Elliot's wrists single-handedly, shoving him back onto the plush velvet duvet. Even as an Omega, his S-class physiology meant his muscles coiled with sheer power under his unbuttoned shirt. Meanwhile, years of cross-tier soothing had deteriorated Elliot's physique to a mere C-class. Just trying to resist the hand planted on his chest felt like an impossible struggle. As Angus fully lost his temper, the room's gentle amber lighting violently warped. It physically manifested into a thick, scorching wave of dark gold energy, like molten lava, pressing down onto Elliot with an inescapable domination, making the entire room shimmer in the phantom heat. "Angus, get a grip." The corners of Elliot's eyes flushed a deep, involuntary red, his chest heaving wildly as he fought for breath. "Get a grip? Will getting a grip change the fact that you cheated on me?" Angus let out a cold laugh, his jaw clenched tight enough to snap. Without another word, he leaned down, marking Elliot's collarbone with a harsh, punishing bite. "I didn't cheat." Elliot fought back, his knuckles turning stark white as his fingers twisted the warm orange sheets into deep knots. "Why do you never listen to a word I say? What the hell am I to you? Just some toy?" Silence. The only answer he got was the dark gold shockwaves warping the air, squeezing the bedside lampshade until it let out a faint, splintering crack. Suddenly, the sharp, icy blue glare of a phone screen on the nightstand sliced through the suffocating, heated amber air. A frantic ringtone shattered the tension. Angus froze. He straightened up, letting out a sharp, impatient click of his tongue. The blue screen cast a cold light over his hardened features. A few seconds later, he snatched his suit jacket off the plush rug and walked out without a single backward glance. "I know. I'm on my way." He hung up the phone, staring down at Elliot on the bed from a commanding height. The volatile, dark gold flares in the air slowly dialed back as he stepped away. "Don't ever go back to that place. Stay in the house where you belong." The door slammed shut. Outside the window, the roar of an engine fired up and faded into the distance. Elliot's rigid posture completely gave out. He curled up under the healing, warm light, descending into a violent fit of coughing, his shoulders shaking helplessly. After a long time, he pushed his trembling legs off the floor, stumbling over to the door and throwing the lock with a definitive click. Sliding down the doorframe, he sat heavily on the ground. Bathed in the soft shadows, he pulled up the very last number in his contacts and hit dial without a second thought. The Koch family estate. Under a brilliant blue sky, soft pastel lisianthus bloomed across pristine white flower beds. Sunlight poured into the drawing room like liquid gold, flooding the expensive Persian rugs. The whole scene was as picture-perfect and inviting as an oil painting. But there was no place for Elliot in this picture. "You're finally willing to sign." From his armchair, Dennis lifted his chin slightly, the sunlight catching the gold rims of his glasses in a sharp, condescending glare. The air around him pulsed with visible, icy white halos that stubbornly pushed away the warm sunlight spilling into the room. "I thought you were going to hold on to your little streak of stubbornness forever. I suppose playing hard to get back then was just an act." Elliot watched the dust motes dancing in the sunbeams. The deeply rooted loneliness of his own childhood, the agonizing battle to keep his son from making the exact same mistakes, it was all compacted into one hauntingly calm gaze. He uncapped his fountain pen. The nib glided effortlessly across the crisp paper. "People have regrets. You were right." Elliot calmly slid the divorce papers to the center of the coffee table. Right there on the page, Angus' signature had already been penned, ink long dried since the very day they got married. "I'm giving up custody. I just want him to be safe and happy." Dennis' cold smirk froze. The icy aura around him stalled for a split second in sheer surprise. "So decisive all of a sudden? If my son hadn't taken an interest in you back then, you never would have even crossed the threshold of this house. When you end up regretting this, don't come crawling back. I want." Elliot stood up, letting the warm sunlight wash over his shoulders. "You might be mistaken about something. Angus never liked me. It was all just a game. 6 years of my youth in exchange for 100 million. The Koch family is nothing if not generous." Leaving those words hanging in the air, Elliot turned on his heel and walked out into the sun-drenched hallway. Just ahead, a tiny figure came sprinting down the hall. It was Ivan. Backlit by the sun, the boy's silhouette was outlined in a soft, fuzzy golden halo. But the second he realized it was Elliot, he slammed to a halt. "Dad." The little boy's young face carried the exact same cold, arrogant expression as Angus. There was absolutely zero warmth, only the deep-seated defensiveness running straight through the Koch family bloodline. Elliot watched the beads of sweat catching the light on his son's forehead. Crouching down, he pulled a soft cotton handkerchief from his pocket and gently reached out to dab the sweat away. "What are you doing at the main house?" Ivan's brows pinched together tightly as he completely dodged Elliot's hand. "I told you not to come here anymore. I'm busy. I don't have time to see you. I have to take over the family someday, so stop bothering me." The warm sun fell softly across Elliot's smiling eyes. He didn't argue. He didn't explain. He simply stood up in silence, taking one last, lingering look at the boy bathed in the morning light. Then, he turned and walked down the long, tree-lined driveway toward the gates. As he passed a trash can on the curb, the soft cotton handkerchief slipped from his fingers, falling silently into the shadows. It was 11 p.m. The warm, golden halo of the wall lamp spilled across the empty master bedroom. Elliot calmly folded his clothes, placing them one by one into his matte suitcase. As his fingertips brushed the edge of a turtleneck, a memory wrapped in that same warm light suddenly crashed over him. It was those nights during Angus rut, when his control slipped and head curl up in Elliot's arms like a beast craving warmth. Sharp canines would pierce his scent gland, and the air would ripple with soft, gentle pink halos, as if time itself was melting into those murmured whispers of like, love, and forever. But once the halo faded, the daytime Angus had nothing but bone-chilling indifference in his eyes. That counterfeit love, fueled only by pheromones, was too fragile to survive the daylight. The crisp, clean zip of the suitcase severed the very last thread of that fake, lingering warmth. Early the next morning, the rising sun coated the flower shop's glass window in a healing, soft gold. The door chime jingled, and the sunlight was suddenly cut off by a towering silhouette. Frank, the blonde, green-eyed alpha, strode right through the sunbeams. His green eyes flashed with an intensely aggressive spark. "Finally found you. Do you have any white roses?" Elliot slid a massive terracotta pot between them with one hand, his gaze guarded and icy. "No. Still holding a grudge over that kiss at the bar? I'm really sorry about that. I lost a bet." Frank blinked, feigning innocence, though his movements were like a starving wolf locking onto its prey. "My name is Frank. I'm not some pathetic escort alpha. I'm Angus' international business partner. Sorry for the misunderstanding." The corner of his mouth curled up, revealing two sharp canines. "You might have caught my scent on him. I really apologize for that. I didn't mean for my pheromones to rub off on him, but you know, our compatibility is at 92%. Elliot's jaw snapped tight. He turned on his heel. "Get out. If you're not mad because of Angus, then what's the issue? How about I let you get your scent on me to make it even?" Frank took a sudden step forward. His towering frame instantly blocked out the warm sunlight pouring over the counter. Before Elliot could even react, Frank's hand shot out like lightning, flicking the scent blocker right off the back of his neck. Rip. With the tear of the patch, Elliot's top-tier alpha pheromones exploded. The air instantly violently warped into countless translucent, pure white blades of light. The blades spiraled and bloomed in midair, forming massive, ethereal white roses. The warm light of the entire room was instantly suppressed. The pure white currents materialized like silver frost, carrying a biting, absolute domination as they drifted down to blanket Frank's shoulders. "Ha, so it's a rose scent." Frank casually rubbed the translucent white shards between his fingertips, laughing recklessly. "Guess I didn't come looking for roses for nothing." Elliot slapped a hand hard over the back of his neck. His knuckles were stark white, his eyes brimming with absolute disgust. "That's sexual harassment. You sick alpha freak." Frank acted like a spoiled kid who had just broken into a greenhouse, carelessly playing with the flowers and leaves in the sun. He dragged out his harassment for 4 straight hours before throwing down a stack of cash to buy out all the ruined flowers and swaggering off. Night fell. The wall sconces in the hotel corridor gave off a relaxing, soft glow. Elliot dragged his exhausted legs across the plush wool carpet. He had just let out a sigh of relief when he spotted that lingering blonde nightmare standing right outside the door to the adjacent room. "Don't get the wrong idea. I'm staying here too." Leaning against the doorframe, Frank waved a keycard at him in the warm shadows. With a sharp beep, his door lock flashed green. What a coincidence. Elliot didn't even have the energy to be angry anymore. He stumbled into his own room, which was bathed in the warm yellow glow of floor lamps. The hot shower washed away the exhaustion of the day. Collapsing into the cloud-like bedding, the faint glare of his phone screen began to blur before his heavy eyelids. Finally, scrolling through apartment listings, he plummeted into a deep sleep. Outside, the steady night rain beat against the glass, blurring the city neon into soft amber halos. Then, the electronic lock let out a chilling beep. Elliot was violently ripped from his dreams by an agonizing grip, snapping around his ankle. Under the dim yellow bedside lamp, Angus' towering shadow loomed over him like a mass of impenetrable black ink, completely trapping him. "You've got some nerve," Angus sneered, his jaw clenching so hard a sharp angle popped along his jawline. "Actually daring to go through with the divorce. Seems I've indulged you way too much." Seeing those eyes brimming with dark hostility, Elliot instinctively shrank back and kicked out hard. But thanks to the sheer physical toll of his cross-tier soothing, that little bit of strength was effortlessly caught by Angus with one hand. Given the massive gap in their physical power, his struggle looked more like a ridiculous attempt at flirting. "We are getting a divorce." Elliot shoved both hands desperately against the burning chest, pressing down on him, his fingertips turning white from the effort. "Get the hell out right now, or I'm calling the cops." "Try it." Angus let go of him, casually tossing Elliot's phone deep into the plush duvet. The mocking look in his eyes was blindingly harsh in the warm light. "I am an Omega. Do you really think the gender protection laws give a damn about an alpha like you?" As the words left his mouth, the cozy, warm yellow halo in the room was violently crushed by an invisible, inescapable domination. A thick, laid gray fog visibly seeped into the air, slithering up the legs of the bed like a nest of frozen snakes, suffocating the very breath in Elliot's lungs. Angus pinned Elliot's wrists securely beneath him. "Cancel the divorce papers. Stop throwing a tantrum." "I am not throwing a tantrum." Elliot's chest heaved violently. The oppressive lead gray fog forced a desperate red flush to the corners of his eyes. 6 years. I tanked my own rank for you, gave up everything, waited on you hand and foot. Is that still not enough? No, it's not. Angus cut off his escape without a second thought. I saved your life. Is your life really that cheap? The suffocation crashed over him like a tidal wave. Elliot finally stopped struggling. Looking up at that flawless, yet completely freezing face so close to his own, his lips trembled uncontrollably. "But Angus, do you even love me?" The thick fog stalled for a fraction of a second. Then, Angus let out a deeply contemptuous laugh. "You're 28 years old, Elliot. Don't act like a child. Who actually marries for love? A marriage works perfectly fine without it. Stop being so dramatic." That arrogant, absolute certainty acted as the blade that finally snapped Elliot's tightly wound nerves. It was all a lie. But I was never that kind of person. Elliot's voice cracked with broken sobs. Tears slipped from the corners of his eyes, crashing into the freezing, lead gray fog. What exactly were these ridiculous 6 years even for? Hold on. With a sharp click, the overhead lights blazed to life. A blinding, flawlessly pure, warm white light instantly blasted through the entire room. The moment that sickening lead gray fog touched the white light, it shrieked and vanished into thin air like melting snow under a scorching sun. Elliot squinted against the glare. Standing in the doorway wearing a loosely tied bathrobe, Frank leaned lazily against the frame. An incredible, healing, warm white halo poured endlessly from his broad shoulders, refilling the room with an unbelievable warmth. "Mr. Angus, harassing your ex-husband after the divorce isn't exactly a good look, is it?" Frank's mouth curved into a mocking smirk. "Abandoning an international negotiation just to run back here. Looks like I'm going to have to reevaluate our partnership." Angus snapped his head around, his brows locked into a deadly scowl. "This has nothing to do with you. It has everything to do with me." Before the words even settled, Frank moved like a bullet. He grabbed Angus by the back of his collar, violently yanked him right off the bed, and threw a heavy, crushing punch straight into that arrogant face. The heavy thud of the impact echoed like a gunshot through the room. The warm white light morphed into a savage gale of blades, completely shredding the gravitational field. Angus tried to throw up in defense. In mere seconds, Angus was pinned helplessly to the thick carpet. The vivid red graze on his temple was striking under the blazing white light. The AI system on the wall flashed blue, automatically dialing emergency services. Frank slumped back onto the floor, half the buttons on his shirt torn completely off. He was just about to throw out a sarcastic joke, but when he turned his head, he saw Elliot curled into a tight ball deep in the bed. Elliot's entire body was rigid. His face was as pale as paper, his bloodless lips opening and closing weakly, unable to make a single sound. The casual indifference vanished from Frank's face in a heartbeat. He immediately climbed onto the bed and pulled that trembling body tightly into his arms. His broad, warm palm smoothed over Elliot's prominent spine, gently soothing him over and over again with endless patience. With his movements, the sharp, warm white blades of light in the air gradually softened, melting into weightless, golden sparks. These sparks, a pure manifestation of healing and comfort, fell like warm spring rain. They gently seeped into Elliot's freezing bones, slowly melting the solid block of ice lodged in his throat. "I'm okay." Just startled, Elliot managed to say, his voice raw and raspy. He let out a weak cough into the warm crook of Frank's neck. Frank didn't let go. Instead, he pulled him in even tighter. The golden sparks wove into an absolutely impenetrable, safe cocoon around them both. "Well, I'm screwed now," Frank whispered, a tender, teasing note in his voice. "The Omega Protection Society is definitely coming for me. If I don't make it back, you'd better come visit me in lockup." The rain continued to rustle against the window, but the atmosphere in the room had miraculously softened. After a long while, Frank gently brushed the stray hairs from Elliot's forehead, testing the waters. "How about I get rid of your little problem once and for all? He saved me in high school." Elliot lowered his eyelashes, cutting him off. The memory rushed back, the faces full of arrogance and disdain at that elite high school, his cheap cafeteria food deliberately knocked to the floor, and the punch Elliot finally threw when he couldn't take the humiliation anymore. Furious parents stormed the school, demanding his immediate expulsion. In the end, it was Angus who stepped up and shielded him from the fallout. And then, the final memory froze on that massive fire, the searing heat warping his vision, the burning beam crashing down, and a blurry silhouette hoisting him out of the suffocating smoke. Because he owed him his life, Elliot had willingly nailed himself to a cross, bleeding himself dry for 6 agonizing years. Frank's voice drifted from above, laced with a razor-sharp mockery. "You married him out of gratitude? A selfish prick like him, charging into a burning building to save someone. Did you actually see his face?" Elliot's breath caught in his throat. "Go check his medical records. They should have his whereabouts for those few days." Frank's words hit like a lightning strike, violently splitting the thick, suffocating fog he'd lived in for the last 6 years. Elliot's eyes snapped open. That thick stack of yellowed medical files, the exact records Dennis had casually tossed at him years ago, were sitting quietly in the sun-drenched study of the Koch estate, just waiting to be cracked open. The windshield wipers of the Maybach slashed frantically back and forth, but they couldn't clear away the torrential downpour threatening to swallow the city whole. With the pedal floored, he sent the estate's heavy wrought iron gates flying open. Second floor, the master bedroom. Dripping with rain and mud, Elliot violently yanked open the bottom drawer. His trembling fingers tore through the yellowed medical files. Finally, under the warm glow of the floor lamp, a single line circled in red ink pierced his eyes. Stellar year 3098, August 12, 1403.49. Entered medical pod. Treatment protocol 1. Duration, 6 hours. A drop of water slipped from his messy hair, splashing onto the page and blurring the ink into a desperate hollow stain. August 12th. That afternoon, the massive fire that had practically burned the entire elite high school auditorium to ash. If Angus was lying in a medical pod, then who was the silhouette that carried him out of that sea of fire? In his mind, the harsh fluorescent lights of a hospital room from a decade ago blazed to life. Angus sat by the bed with his usual arrogant air. "You're finally awake. Good thing I went through all that trouble to save you." Elliot had just woken up, his head still spinning. Hearing that, Head instinctively asked, "Angus, was it you who saved me in the fire?" After a long pause, Elliot heard Angus give a soft huff. Of course, it was an admission, but those few seconds of suspicious hesitation hadn't been arrogance at all. It was the guilt of a thief. 10 years, over 3,600 days and nights. He had reduced himself to a pathetic, begging dog, all for a stolen favor. "Dad." A tiny voice shattered the memory. Ivan stood outside the cracked door, holding a small handkerchief. Standing on his tiptoes, the boy gently wiped away the cold rain from Elliot's neck. "You're completely soaked. Why didn't you use an umbrella?" For the very first time, a trace of unguarded attachment shone in the boy's eyes. Elliot numbly forced a smile that looked worse than crying. This boy was the only real thing to come out of these 6 years. But now, he had to sever this very last weakness. Blinding, cold white light flooded the visitation room of the Omega Protection Society. On the other side of the glass, Frank wore his signature wicked grin. His blonde hair was a mess, but it couldn't hide his brazen charm. "Darling, you really did come to visit me. Did you know something?" Elliot stared dead into those green eyes. Frank's smile completely faded. Those eyes, usually so full of mockery, were now as quiet and deep as an ancient forest. "I know that when you were little, you liked to save your dinner until right before bed. I know you used to play in the mud and made friends with 2 little blades of grass." Those damp, moldering memories locked away in the deepest recesses of his mind were effortlessly laid bare by Frank. "You've been held hostage by your own sense of morality for way too long. I didn't tell you directly because I wanted you to cut the ties yourself." Frank's long fingers lightly traced Elliot's silhouette through the glass. "Don't be so quick to write off the future. Once the divorce is final, it'll take you to see the world. Didn't you say when you were a kid that you wanted to take those blades of grass on a trip around the world?" Frank laughed. It was a pure, completely untainted smile. The rain had stopped at the main estate. Sunlight pierced through the clouds, illuminating the Koch family crest until it gleamed brilliantly. The Maybach rolled to a stop. Outside the front doors, Ivan was no longer the cold, arrogant heir. He was sobbing like any ordinary boy about to lose his father, throwing himself desperately into Elliot's arms. "Dad, are you abandoning me?" Fighting back the intense burn in his eyes, Elliot picked the boy up and stepped straight into the magnificent cage that had trapped him for 6 years. In the center of the living room, the crystal chandelier cast a freezing glare. Angus' head was wrapped in stark white bandages, his face deathly pale. Those endlessly arrogant eyes were now completely bloodshot with sheer panic. The butler handed over the divorce papers, black and white, final and absolute. "Are you really that thrilled to finally get this divorce?" Angus shot to his feet, his voice shaking as he lost his grip on reality. "Elliot, you're going to regret this. You'll never see Ivan again." The same old threat. Elliot let out a soft laugh. He dropped the contract he'd gotten from Frank right onto the coffee table. "That 100 million, involuntarily gifting it all to Ivan. I don't want custody." "What?" Angus froze in his tracks. Ivan nervously gripped Elliot's sleeve. "Dad, please don't leave me alone." Elliot gently ruffled his hair. "You'll get the absolute best education in the Koch family. You're going to grow up to be someone incredible, just like the heroes in the stories we used to read. This 100 million is the most precious gift I can give you. If you ever want to see me, just call." "But Father said that if I just listened to him and treated you coldly, you'd stay with me forever." The boy suddenly realized the horrifying truth. He whipped his head toward Angus, screaming hysterically, "You lied to me. Just because your own dad doesn't love you, why did you have to lie to me? Liar." Angus' face went completely ashen. That accusation was like a razor-sharp knife, brutally shredding his false bravado. "Butler, take the young master upstairs." The boy's crying faded into the distance. A dead silence fell over the living room. "I didn't cheat." Angus quickly stepped up to Elliot, his towering frame suddenly looking hunched and broken. He softened his voice, almost begging, yet it still carried that ridiculous tone of granting a favor. "Those photos, it was just business. If it bothers you, I won't go anymore. I know you still love me. Just tear up the divorce papers and I can pretend none of this ever happened." Looking at the pathetic man standing in front of him, a burst of completely uninhibited, cathartic laughter ripped from Elliot's chest. "Angus, you are genuinely so pathetic." Elliot's smile vanished. His eyes were colder than the crystal chandelier hanging above them. "Your father doesn't love you. He just uses you as a tool. Your partner doesn't love you. Even your own flesh and blood hates your guts. You don't even have the capacity to love anyone. You aren't worthy of being loved at all. Shut up." Angus' eyes nearly split open with rage, completely skewered in his deepest, most agonizing wound. Elliot didn't waste another breath. He pulled out that rain-soaked, yellowed medical record from his pocket and violently whipped it right into that deathly pale face. The paper sliced through the air with a sharp, piercing hiss. Our marriage was a lie from the very first second. Elliot stared at Angus, completely shattered, horrifically twisted expression of shock like he was looking at a pathetic, lifeless object. If I were you, I wouldn't even want to exist. Without wasting a single backward glance on him, Elliot turned on his heel and strode right out the massive doors that had trapped him for 6 long years. The sunlight cascaded down, stretching his silhouette into something incredibly tall and completely free. The heavy, suffocating chains that had bound him for so long shattered, piece by piece, into a million fragments. The speeding off-road vehicle left the gloom of Y-City far behind. The background blurred in a rapid montage, the vast, golden desert rolling with heat waves under the relentless sun, the towering mountain peaks, their pure white snow refracting a blinding, icy light, and the sprawling fields of Provence, where the breeze set off waves of soft, violet-red blooms. Finally, the scene settled into the tranquil stillness of the countryside at night. The world was so quiet, only the sound of the wind remained. The deep blue night sky stretched out like a massive sheet of velvet, the shimmering Milky Way pouring its soft starlight across the grass without reserve. Frank lay back in the field, with his arms behind his head, a blade of foxtail grass dangling lazily from his lips. Under the starlight, his green eyes glinted with a warm, gentle glow. When Elliot asked him once again who he truly was, Frank just smiled. "Consider me your childhood friend." He turned his head to look at Elliot beside him. Elliot's eyelashes fluttered slightly under the starlight. As he watched the blade of grass in Frank's mouth, a faint, genuine smile couldn't help but bloom at the corners of his lips. So, it turned out that the 2 little blades of grass that had kept him company in the dark, damp mud of his childhood could actually take human form. Frank instantly saw through Elliot's absurd train of thought. "I am not a blade of grass." Frank shot up to a sitting position, his usual lazy demeanor completely shattered. He ran his hands through his dazzling blonde hair in frustration, leaving it hopelessly tangled, his fingertips slicing through the air in the starlight. "My hair used to be black, you know. Black hair, a companion in the mud, and the silhouette of a boy who left behind a note and vanished when he was 18. The moss-covered fragments deep within his memories suddenly pieced themselves together under the gentle starlight, forming a clear, familiar face. Elliot could no longer hold back the mirth in his eyes. His laughter rippled softly into the silent night sky. "Stop laughing. I told you, not a blade of grass." Frustrated, Frank pounced, tackling Elliot down into the soft grass. They tumbled together through the dew-kissed field, their warm breaths mingling. The very air around them seemed infected by the pure joy of the moment, shimmering with visible, warm, golden waves of healing light. It turned out that he had a friend all along. And it turned out that after 10 stolen years, he still had a future waiting for him. Angus' side story. As the sole heir to the Koch family empire, Angus had spent his entire life living under the suffocating shadow of his father, Dennis. In his study, a harsh, stark white overhead light was always on, and the air was perpetually swirled with the tangible, razor-sharp, ice-cold aura of a high-tier Omega. The grueling hours spent kneeling on cold marble floors, the physical training pushed to the point of muscular spasm, it all forged him into a flawless, emotionless machine. That was until his final year of high school, when the machine's gears finally skipped a beat. The amber glow of the setting sun pierced through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Telek High, staining the corridors a blood like crimson. Elliot, a boy from the lower rungs of society who possessed a beauty as sharp and dangerous as a cold weapon, was currently stepping on a group of self-important elite brats. His black hair was soaked with sweat, his knuckles stained with vivid, glaring blood. The air around him shimmered and warped from his unbridled, explosive aggression. Yet, when Elliot turned his head, those eyes were like a pool of water, capable of embracing the entire world. Angus watched from the shadows, a wicked, cold smirk playing on his lips as he looked at his rival sprawled on the ground, beaten and bruised. He shouldered the full brunt of Dennis' fury, spending a grueling half-month being torn apart by wild beasts in the undeveloped dense forest, followed by 3 days submerged in the haunting blue nutrient fluid of a medical pod. He did it all just to secure an absolutely loyal underling. Why do you always space out? In his memories, sunlight trickled through the gaps in the leaves, casting mottled, warm patches of light onto Elliot's soft, dark hair. Elliot looked up slowly, his beautiful eyes filled with a blank, dull confusion. Hungry. Spacing out. Conserves energy. Watching that dead serious face, Angus burst into laughter under the sun. How could there be an alpha like this, one who made you want to crush his shell just to see what other expressions he might hide? However, the shadows of fate abruptly severed on the night of the graduation party. Due to a pheromone flare-up, Angus' room was flooded with violent, dark red light spots that boiled like magma. He missed his confession, and he missed that fire. In the private ward of the hospital, only one dim floor lamp was lit. Angus stared fixedly at the pale Elliot on the bed, his nails digging deep into his own palms. He had already found out the truth. The person who saved Elliot was a black-haired alpha who had been on the brink of death. If Elliot discovered the truth, would those eyes that always looked at him turn to someone else? No, Elliot belonged only to him. Elliot's fingers twitched on the bedsheet, and he slowly opened his eyes. The moment their gazes collided, Angus' heart hammered against his ribs, but he maintained a perfect, icy mask, letting his possessiveness roil beneath the surface. So, was it you who saved me? Elliot's weak voice echoed through the room. The air fell into a suffocating silence. Angus' jawline tightened to the breaking point. In those few seconds, he smothered every ounce of his guilt and hypocrisy, finally pulling his lips into a condescending arc. Of course, the real black-haired alpha who had charged into the hellfire was, at that moment, completely erased from Elliot's life. During their senior year KTV party, the colorful strobe lights cut through the private room, creating a surreal, fractured reality. Is there anyone in this room you like? Angus looked at the intoxicated Elliot beside him, watching his hand reach for the glass. A mix of wicked mischief and suppressed madness surged into his throat. Yeah, I do. Elliot. He watched with a smirk as Elliot's face froze, while his own heart screamed, "You idiot. I love you." A week later, in the study, the cold white pressure filled the room again. Dennis slammed 2 blank marriage and divorce agreements onto the rosewood desk. Sign them, and you can be with that pathetic, low-class alpha. Dennis frowned in disgust, shards of ice manifesting in the air. Why are you always obsessed with such fragile, low-status trash? This time, protect your toy properly. Don't come crying to me when you break it again. Angus kept his head bowed, the light casting deep shadows across his brow. His father had already approached Elliot, and the blockhead, who took relationships so seriously, had actually agreed. Euphoria, like a blast of dark gold flame, exploded in Angus' eyes. Since he agreed to marry, it meant Elliot must love him back. As long as he signed the papers, as long as he remained powerful enough, he could lock this prey in the greenhouse he had built forever. Without a moment's hesitation, Angus picked up the pure gold fountain pen and signed his name with a sharp, decisive flick, binding the two of them together forever. The ink was still wet. Under the harsh, cold white light, Angus looked at his own signature and curved his lips into a near-pathological, sickly smile. He truly believed that as long as he held the person captive, they would be happy. They would definitely be happy. Frank's side story. In the endless, drizzling rain of the borderlands, the sky was a suffocating lead gray. In these slums where even the air tasted of moldy dampness, the starving, fugitive black-haired boy Frank collapsed under a dead tree. The bloodbath of the mafia family, the horrific sight of his mother starving to death on a smuggling boat, these cold, desperate scenes flashed rapidly across Frank's dilated pupils. Until a pair of worn, washed-out canvas shoes entered his line of sight. Frank struggled to open his eyes. Through the hazy rain, he saw Elliot. He was a boy with soft black curls, quietly crouching in the mud, his long lashes lowered as he whispered to 2 withered blades of grass. He looked just like a gentle little lamb. In that moment, the endless gloom seemed to be torn open by an unseen force. A rare, warm, pale gold beam of sunlight fell squarely on Elliot's skin, which was pale enough to look transparent. He was surrounded by a healing, soft glow that felt utterly out of place in this desperate wasteland, like a deity who had stumbled into a graveyard. The deity turned his head, his obsidian pure eyes watching Frank quietly. No disgust, no terror. Elliot simply walked closer, pulled an expired nutrition pack from his frayed pocket, and held it out. The rough plastic tubing reflected a faint, fleeting warmth in the dim light. "Eat," Elliot said, his voice barely a whisper, like a breeze brushing past his ear, carrying a gentleness that would not be refused. "You don't have to pay me back." The bitter fluid slid down Frank's throat, but it ignited a raging bonfire in his cold chest. That fire sustained them as they huddled together for warmth in that dark basement, filled with murky air and empty bottles. Elliot gave his only piece of moisture-proof cardboard to Frank. In the pitch-black night, listening to the growl of Elliot's stomach from hunger, watching that thin silhouette huddled in the corner, Frank vowed in his heart to build a true home, full of sunshine and flowers, for this gentle little lamb. However, that fleeting warmth was soon torn apart by a violent, thunderous crash. At midnight, the basement's broken wooden door was kicked open. The cold, stark white glare of the streetlights sliced into the dark like a blade. A hulking, booze-soaked shadow lunged in like a mad dog, dragging Elliot out of the corner. Elliot didn't scream. He bit his pale lower lip, his jawline locked tight in a heartbreaking, practiced silence. "Get out!" Frank's eyes were bloodshot. He rammed into the man like an angry wolf cub, only to be kicked down and slammed against the floor. The man grabbed Frank's black hair, forcing his head up. "You actually dared to bring a bug home." The dull, heavy sound of a beating echoed in the confined space. Frank was dragged and thrown out into the bone-chilling, torrential rain like a rag doll. Mud and blood from his nose blurred Frank's vision. He gritted his teeth, his fingernails digging deep, bloody furrows into the dirt. Under the flashes of white lightning, he crawled back toward the basement with stubborn, agonizing persistence. In the dim corner, Elliot sat blankly on that piece of cardboard. A vivid, shocking red palm print stained his cheek, the light in his eyes completely extinguished. "Why did you come back?" Elliot lowered his eyes, his voice laced with broken despair. "Just go. This isn't a home." Frank wiped the blood and rain from his face. Through the haze, he stared at him with burning intensity. "Elliot, let's go find a home." Finding a home was hard. They wandered at first, and only after they both differentiated as alphas were, they sent to school by the border administration. But the administration only sent them. They didn't pay the tuition. Frank's grades were poor, so he started fighting in underground boxing matches after graduation. When the little lamb found out, he would occasionally come to watch. Two boys struggling for survival finally earned enough through countless cracked knuckles to rent a tiny, cramped room that was truly their own. There was only a narrow bed, but a single warm yellow incandescent bulb hanging from the ceiling bathed the room in a soft, caramel glow. This layer of warm, healing light became their absolute barrier against the frozen outside world. Late at night, Elliot's brows would knot in pain as he slept, cold sweat beading on his forehead, his body trembling uncontrollably, the trauma buried deep in his bone marrow. Whenever that happened, Frank would reach out his sturdy arms, pulling Elliot tight into his chest. "It's okay, it's okay. We're home." Frank pressed his chin against Elliot's soft black hair, his warm chest flush against his back. The steady, powerful heartbeat felt through their skin, slowly dispelled the gloom of Elliot's dreams, helping him find a rhythmic, steady breath again under the warm yellow light. Until that afternoon. At the end of the alley, a luxurious hover car was parked against a crumbling wall. The door opened, and a high-status Omega stepped out, brows furrowed, his gaze sweeping over the muddy puddles with disgust. "So broken. Can people even live here?" "Elliot, come home with me." Hidden in the shadows of the stairwell, Frank's hands clenched into fists, his knuckles cracking. A poisonous mix of inferiority and resentment gnawed at his heart. Yet standing in the sunlight, Elliot frowned slightly. Without a hint of hesitation, he shook his head with absolute resolve. "This is my home." In that instant, Frank heard his own frantic heartbeat miraculously calm. When Frank pushed open the door, nursing fresh bruises from the boxing ring, the afternoon sun was streaming through the tiny window, spreading a warm, healing layer of gold across the room. Elliot was tilting his head back to drink water, the sunlight gilding his profile with a fuzzy, warm halo. Those dark eyes, always so calm, looked like a shimmering lake, so beautiful it hurt to look away. Hearing the movement, Elliot set down his glass. When he saw Frank's wounds, his brows snapped together, and he hurried over with a medical spray. "Why are you so hurt?" A soft palm, still holding the residual warmth of the sun, covered Frank's eyes. As his vision was blocked, the spray turned into a cool mist, gently landing on his wounds and bringing a slight, ticklish sensation. This healing itch traveled along his nerves, straight to Frank's heart. Just as Elliot reached to lift his shirt to check for other injuries, Frank's breath hitched. He hurriedly shoved something he had been hiding behind his back into Elliot's arms. "This is flowers?" Elliot's eyes widened. In his arms lay a bouquet of colorful fake flowers, clumsily folded from cheap wrapping paper. Despite the rough material, under the healing sunbeams piercing the window pane, the fake flowers reflected a luster even more brilliant and vibrant than the real thing. Yeah, a gift. Watching the instant surprise and emotion light up Elliot's eyes, Frank couldn't help but laugh, revealing a pair of spirited, youthful canines. Surrounded by the warmth of the light, he prayed fervently in his heart. "Little lamb, I hope we can stay in this home forever, never to be separated." A single column of golden, gilded light leaked through the stained glass dome, cutting a clear boundary of light and shadow in the dim church. This holy light fell precisely on Elliot's fair, transparent face, casting a divine radiance onto his soft black hair. Hiding in the shadows, Frank stared fixedly at that glimmer of light, his fingernails digging white marks into the cold floor. In that moment, the hostility roiling in his eyes miraculously subsided. If God truly existed, then this boy who had once handed him an expired nutrition pack was the only salvation to ever descend upon his barren life. Fate, however, is a cruel and ruthless editor. After meeting that Omega, Frank threw himself into the underground boxing ring, fighting with a manic desperation, hoping only to stack up more money. One day, stumbling out of the ring, battered and bruised, he was met by a middle-aged man, his uncle. His uncle had spent years searching and finally found him. Aside from the desire to avenge his mother, the only other thought in Frank's mind was that he could finally give his little lamb a life of comfort. He rushed home, desperate to share the good news. But all he found was a note left behind. Elliot had gone to a class reunion. Frank never got the chance to tell him. A fire broke out at the reunion. Frank forced his way into the inferno, weaving his pheromones into a barrier to shield Elliot as he carried him out. He suffered severe burns, and his brain, damaged by the pheromone surge, was failing. His uncle whisked him away to Y Country for treatment. For 3 years, Frank lay in a genetic repair pod in a coma. When he finally woke, his appearance had been irrevocably altered. He was now the spitting image of his late father. His power level, too, had ascended to S-class. After a year of grueling physical therapy, Frank flew back to C Country, desperate to see Elliot, only to be met with the news of his marriage. To the very same Omega Frank had seen loitering outside Elliot's workplace that day. From then on, Frank never set foot in C Country again, throwing his entire existence into the war for leadership. Finally, he held the severed head of the former leader and dropped it at his mother's grave. He figured he would never see his lamb again, until he met Elliot's partner, Angus, in Y Country. Under the frantic strobe of a dark alley, Angus' face, twisted by his heat cycle, looked utterly wretched. Frank felt a surge of pure, visceral disgust and shoved the hand Angus reached out toward him away. Finally, unable to stand the distance, Frank returned to C Country under the guise of a business partnership. He saw the person he had dreamed of for 5 long years.
He wasn't happy.
Why wasn't he happy? Frank felt a tidal wave of anger, confusion, and heartache. "Little lamb, you told me once that you would only marry for love. Why are you so sad, even when you're living in what they call love?" Back in Y Country, Frank spent countless sleepless nights haunted by the sadness in Elliot's eyes. "Little lamb, you're not happy. Then come with me." Frank made his choice. He would force a divorce. But as he held the report proving their 92% compatibility in his hands, a despicable plan began to take shape. Beneath the warm yellow bathroom sconces, Frank leaned over the marble sink and retched. His phone screen glowed with the intimate photos he had personally faked to corner Elliot into a divorce. Staring at Elliot's red-rimmed, sorrowful eyes on the screen, Frank clenched his jaw so hard it ached, forcing himself to swallow every ounce of his own self-loathing. He would bring his little lamb away from that hollow cage. The healing, warm orange sunset turned the surface of the sea into molten gold. As the sea breeze ruffled Elliot's soft black hair, He turned around, his dark eyes reflecting the sparkling water as they locked onto Frank's. "Frank?" Elliot's voice was soft, but it carried the weight of 1,000 tons. "The one who saved me. It was you all along, wasn't it? You were severely injured, weren't you? Let me see. Please?" There was a note of pleading in his eyes. The wind stood still. Frank's Adam's apple bobbed with difficulty. He didn't speak. Instead, he slowly undid the buttons of his shirt. The warm yellow sunset poured unreservedly over his broad chest. There, etched into his skin, was a massive, gnarled, and hideous burn scar the size of a palm. Elliot's breath hitched. A strong, involuntary red flush swept across his eyes. His trembling fingertips hovered in midair before, like the lightest feather, they cautiously made contact with the uneven, scarred skin. The moment he was touched, Frank's muscles went rigid, a dark tide surging beneath his gaze. It was a touch of profound tenderness, yet it hit Frank like a bullet wrapped in flames, piercing straight through his chest and sending a shiver of agonizing skin-crawling pleasure and pain through his nerves. Frank took his lamb home. It was a land of endless snow-capped mountains, a pure white world where the sun was impossibly warm. Elliot wore a snow-white robe, embroidered with emerald vines, the translucent veil trailing behind him fluttering in the mountain wind, like wings about to take flight. He stepped through the deep, powdery snow, looking like the very first hint of spring breaking through the heart of winter. To shield him from the high-altitude chill, Frank released his top-tier alpha pressure without reservation. There was no scent, but instead, a breathtaking visual spectacle, countless ice crystals, refracting the warm golden sunlight, materialized around them. They expanded and bloomed, transforming into translucent, frosty white roses. The edges of the petals shimmered with a warm, pale pink halo, shielding Elliot within them and holding the bitter cold completely at bay. Near the journey's end, Elliot stopped amidst the swirling frost roses. He turned, his arched brows holding a smile warmer than the sun. "Owen, thank you." The swirling frost petals hung suspended in midair. Frank's mind went blank, his green pupils dilated. "I think, when you held me at the hotel, I just knew it was you," Elliot said, a gentle curve forming at his lips. "But you didn't seem to want me to know you were Owen. I'm just too happy today." I couldn't help but say it. There was no blame in those obsidian eyes, only a bottomless capacity for tolerance and love. The destiny that had been suppressed for over a decade finally ignited. Frank stepped forward, grabbed Elliot's wrist, and pulled the slight figure, wrapped in those embroidered green vines, tightly into his burning embrace. The surrounding frost roses vanished into warm, golden sand, swallowing the bitter winter whole. Beneath the dazzling light, he lowered his head and, with a mix of religious reverence and raw, aggressive possession, kissed the spring that belonged only to him.
The story ends here, but my mind is still racing. I absolutely adore Frank's character. Hez like a wild wolf that fought his way out of the darkness and the mud. To the outside world, he radiates the absolute domination and ruthless aggression of an S-class alpha. But in front of Elliot, he is always the protector who knows how to bow his head, almost reverent in his devotion. As for Elliot, even as an alpha, he lacks that traditional, overbearing arrogance. Instead, he carries a gentle warmth that embraces everything, much like still water. But he is by no means weak. Deep down in his bones lies an unbreakable resilience. He is fiercely loyal, strong, and deeply kind. To repay a debt of gratitude, he was willing to stand in Angus' shadow, quietly enduring his cold indifference. But the second he realized that his 6-year marriage and all his agonizing suffering were built on a fabricated lie, he didn't hesitate for a single moment. He decisively walked away from custody, left the 100 million to his child, and ruthlessly slammed those medical records right into Angus' face. I honestly think that if Angus had just treated Elliot well after they got married, if he had actually put some real effort into him, Elliot would have fallen in love with him a long time ago. After all, he is such an incredibly gentle soul. But the high and mighty Angus viewed love as nothing more than charity. He used a lie to trap Elliot by his side, only to constantly tear him down and treat him like he didn't even exist. His blinding arrogance and selfishness ultimately cost him absolutely everything. Yet, even knowing Angus lost it all, my heart still aches for Elliot. Thankfully, the story ends with Frank healing Elliot, and honestly, it healed me too. So what do you guys think? Was Frank right to step in and take Elliot back? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button, and I'll catch you all in the next one.